I'm Jeff Cook, president of the United Methodist Insurance Company, and I want to talk to you about the importance of having insurance designed specifically to meet the needs of churches. We will take the matter in three parts. We'll discuss how the Book of Discipline acknowledges and addresses those differences, and then we will look at the needs of churches, first as it relates to property, and then to liability matters. Before we close, we will briefly discuss the best way to find insurance that helps meet your needs. This video is for information purposes only. We cannot know your specific situation and local or state laws, so be sure to work with insurance, legal, and tax experts to see how this applies to your church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 30, the Apostle Paul asks, "Why are we in danger every hour?" Every venture, including life, has risks. In this world, everything we do carries its own risks. While many are common to each vocation, they all have their own specific risks. There is no single policy form which can provide coverage for all types of commercial and philanthropic activity. That's why it's important to have an agent and insurance company that understands the risks faced specifically by churches. It is also important for churches to understand that the Book of Discipline recognizes those differences and calls churches to address them and to confirm to their charge conference that they are being responsible stewards of their people, property, and finances. Letitia Mayberry Wright, the Deputy General Counsel for the General Counsel on Finance and Administration, is going to walk us through the Book of Discipline references to insurance and bonding.
Paragraph 2533.2 of the Book of Discipline requires trustees to compare the adequacy of their church's insurance to the minimum requirements provided by the General Counsel on Finance and Administration, which we will shorten and call GCFA. This comparison is to be included in the trustees' report to the charge conference, along with recommendations for improvement per paragraph 2550.7. The purpose of the minimum requirements is to see that appropriate levels of coverage are maintained and that risks unique to churches are covered. These requirements are in place to help protect the people, property, and finances of the church, in order for the church to be able to focus on its mission without additional disruption when events happen. It is important to note that minimum requirements are tailored for different church needs, so churches of different sizes have different requirements, making sure that all churches have adequate and attainable recommendations. These requirements are based on a lot of research and thought. First, a review of industry standard is performed with input from insurance companies, service providers, conferences, and churches. Then the recommendation is sent to UMI's Board of Directors, then GCFA's Committee on Fiduciary Foundation and Property Matters, and then it is sent to GCFA's Board of Directors for final approval. The schedule is published on GCFA and UMI's website, and some conferences have their own schedules as well. If your conference recommendations vary, they will be available through your conference website or through its treasurer's office. One question regarding requirements that we often receive relates to bonding. If you have crime coverage, does your treasurer still need to be bonded? The answer is yes, for two reasons. Paragraph 258.4 Part B of the Book of Discipline requires that treasurers be bonded, and the drafters of the discipline inserted this portion for thoughtful reasons. First, insurance generally does not provide coverage to volunteers. If your treasurer is not a paid position, or if volunteers handle funds, they may not be covered by your insurance policy. Second, the sublimit for crime in most policies is not sufficient to cover your church's exposure. Third, from a financial perspective, crime coverage normally comes with a high deductible. Most bonds cost 10% to 20% of the deductible, and in the event of loss, you have no out-of-pocket expenses. Small churches can normally obtain this coverage for $150 to $200. Churches provide their bonding information in the report of the Finance Committee on Question 12. If your local agent cannot provide you with a bond, UMIP can provide a quote and place coverage over the phone. Paragraph 807.19 charges GCFA with operating an insurance program that is available to churches, agencies, and institutions of the connection. In paragraph 2533, GCFA is also given responsibility for establishing an insurance schedule that we refer to as the minimum insurance requirements. This helps ensure that churches always have a source they can rely on that understands churches' needs and can provide coverage that meets those needs.
We won't go through the minimum insurance requirements today. You can read those for yourselves and check with your conference to see if they have their own requirements. What we will do is talk about the specific concerns of churches. First, we will talk about property exposures. Traditionally, churches have property unique to houses of worship: stained glass, pipe organs, hardwood pews, and fine arts. These items are often scheduled on policies to ensure that they are insured at their replacement value, unless, of course, these items would be replaced with less expensive alternatives or not replaced at all. In that case, you should work with your agent and other advisors to determine what that would look like and how it would affect the values you report for coverage. The same thinking may apply to your building. Often a church would not replace its existing building with the same architectural detail. It may build back smaller or with a design that is better able to save the evolving mission to meet the needs of its congregation and community. If you plan on building a less expensive replacement, or one that would cost much less than rebuilding the existing church, you should consider insuring using functional replacement valuation. This involves having a very specific plan for the replacement building with a sound cost estimate. Note also that you cannot use the functional replacement valuation method without the written approval of your conference. Coverage for the pastor's personal property at the church may be limited. You need to verify the amount of coverage in place for that to make sure that it matches the value of the pastor's property at the church. In addition, you need to make sure that the pastor's property at the parsonage or rented dwelling is properly insured. Property in your care, custody, or control may not have adequate or any coverage, and you should make sure that your agent is aware of any property you hold that you do not own. Property that you routinely use off-site, such as sound equipment, risers, etc., should be covered under an inland marine policy. Inland marine policies are property policies written to cover special use items or property that is transportable or movable by nature. These policies are widely available. Consideration should also be given to property related to any other types of use you make of your church. This could include food service, thrift shops, food banks, etc. Making sure your agent knows about these exposures helps with valuation, identification of items that are uninsured or underinsured, and in the assessment of your church's liability exposures. Speaking of liability, let's move on to exposures that are unique to or of particular interest to churches. The first is the issue of pastoral counseling. This exposure exists for your church regardless of whether it is provided for a fee or with no charge. Claims can arise from formal counseling sessions or from advice given in impromptu or casual settings. Consider the case of a congregant running into a pastor in the park. Perhaps the congregant engages in a friendly conversation with the pastor and ends up asking for advice about a situation in their life. The pastor advises and offers some insight. This exchange could be considered counseling and therefore still carries risk, even if it seems relatively insignificant or outside of the scope of the pastor's responsibilities. The minimum limits set forth in the minimum insurance requirements are $1 million per occurrence and $3 million in aggregate for this coverage. Many churches have policies and procedures in place to help ensure members of the congregation can safely receive spiritual guidance. While these policies are strongly recommended, they do not eliminate the need to have pastoral counseling liability coverage. Remember, lawsuits can happen whether an allegation is justified or not, and legal costs can add up quickly. It is an unfortunate fact that sexual misconduct is a reason that many churches find themselves in court or in the public eye. Insurance cannot undo the damage from misconduct or allegations of misconduct, but it can help mitigate the cost to defend and settle a claim of misconduct. Even false allegations can result in significant legal expense. This is why the minimum insurance for congregations with over 500 members are $1 million per occurrence and $2 million in aggregate. Limits are $250,000 and $500,000 for congregations with membership under 500. Policies to help limit the chance of misconduct such as pre-employment screening, are critical, but they are no substitute for proper insurance coverage. While misconduct can do the most damage to people and to the church's public image, slips and falls are the most frequent source of liability claims against churches. At least that's been UMI's experience. That's why the minimum insurance requirements include a minimum for medical payments. Medical payments can be used to pay expenses without regard to fault to those who slip or fall on your property. This can limit the out-of-pocket expenses of the injured party and perhaps reduce the likelihood of a suit being filed. The recommended amount in the minimum insurance requirements is $10,000, but more is better if you can get it. One thing to remember is that this coverage is not available to injuries sustained by your employees. And while we're speaking of employees, let's discuss workers' compensation. Many small churches are tempted to opt out of purchasing this coverage. Your state may allow you to opt out based on the number of employees or the simple fact that you're a church. However, you are opting into exposing the church to civil suits from employees. In addition, other employees may sue their fellow employees if they feel that their coworkers' negligence caused the injury. Injuries sustained on the job, including automobile accidents, are generally excluded from coverage under health insurance. Without workers' compensation, the bills incurred become the responsibility of the injured worker. Your workers' compensation policy may even provide coverage for a disease acquired on a mission trip. Another issue is coverage for volunteers. Some states allow it and some do not. If your state does not allow it, you should consider waivers, hold harmless agreements, and coverage available to you through your general liability policy. If you want the coverage but are concerned with the cost of a minimum premium policy, you can check with your conference to see if there's a master workers' compensation policy. This can help you get coverage at a cost that is much lower than the state's minimum policy premium. If you are not in Ohio, North Dakota, Washington, or Wyoming, UMI may be able to help you access a master policy. Okay, on to one final liability issue that deals with the use of churches' property and facilities. Churches have always been a gathering place in the community. This includes use not only by the congregation, but also by other community organizations. This is becoming increasingly common, especially as churches look to ways to increase their role in the community, and in many cases to generate income or encourage economic growth in their area. First, make sure your agent and carrier are aware of the nature of the use of the property. Some actions may necessitate a change in coverage and possibly even a change in insurance carriers. Second, have a facilities use agreement in place. Some insurance companies may be able to provide you with a basic agreement. GCFA has a basic agreement for use with Boy Scout troops and is working on a general agreement. Facilities use agreements specify some basic guidelines, waive liability, and should require the organization to carry limits at least equal to your basic policy limits, not including your umbrella coverage. Make sure you get a certificate of insurance that specifies their limits of coverage and identifies their insurance carrier. Make sure you update the status periodically to make sure that the coverage is still in force with adequate limits. Finally, if the use of your facility is generating income, you need to make sure that you understand if it affects your property tax exemption and if the revenue creates an unrelated business taxable income consequence. A lot of things can affect your tax exempt status. Each state has varying rules, but mixing nonprofit and commercial uses and participating in political campaigns are typical reasons. One Texas church lost its status on a property it owned for operating a Christian exercise program, even though the fees charged didn't even cover the cost of the program. In Tennessee, for example, an attached coffee shop is not exempt even if the revenue earned supports the institution as a whole. As I am not a lawyer or a tax expert and I don't know the details of your situation or your state requirements, you should work with local experts to develop your agreements and determine how the use of your facility affects your exempt status or your income tax liabilities. Now that we've covered some ground on church-specific insurance, let's talk briefly about the selection of agents and insurance carriers. The first step is making sure your agent has access to carriers that specialize in covering churches or at least have the coverages necessary to meet minimum insurance requirements. Ideally, your agent should be able to provide you a list of the churches they insure and provide you with references. Be familiar with the carriers that are most likely to provide the coverage you need. If your conference is a mandatory conference, you can rely on that coverage. In non-mandatory conferences, your treasurer's office may recommend a carrier or carriers, or possibly even some agents to work with. Here is a partial, though not exhaustive, list of carriers to consider. As always, UMI is available to help ensure that the coverage you receive meets the minimum insurance requirements. We shop your needs to multiple carriers to try to give you as many options as possible. If you work with carriers such as Guide One, Church Mutual Insurance, Brotherhood Mutual, Philadelphia Insurance, Hiscox, or Mennonite Mutual, it's very likely that they'll be able to meet your church-specific needs. Larger commercial insurance companies can also provide coverage for churches, but if you place coverage with one of them, make sure that your agent has obtained all the specific coverages we discussed today, especially misconduct and pastoral counseling. Thank you for your time and for all that you do for the church, its people, and its mission.
To continue to receive updates on vital information to protect your church, people, property, and finances, be sure to sign up for the Church Protection Connection at www.uminsure.org. And if you're looking for insurance for your church, you can also request a quote through the United Methodist Insurance Program.